Hello and welcome to Warframe Unabridged. I'm your host Fen, and today we will be discussing the next power in our Unabridged journey through the power kit of Atlas, Petrify. Now this is a very interesting power. With the advent of Atlas and this power, the petrification effect was first introduced into the game. Now this power is very peculiar in the way it functions, as it's similar to many other status effects, but at the same time it's unlike any other status for a variety of reasons. Let's go over the differences. Now the first status element that can be similar is cold. It emulates 2 out of 3 of the effects of petrification, be it the slowing effect or the petrify effect when enemies are frozen solid. Now the latter can only be achieved really under rare circumstances, primarily with Frost's powers, and not with any other frame that I'm aware of. Now the second status element is heat, which can panic enemies in the same way that enemies are panicked when they first get hit with petrify. That's pretty much where the similarities end with this power. The distinctions are much greater. Now most statuses are instantaneous, while petrify is gradual, leading to the outcome eventually of them being petrified, and sometimes not even going that far. No other status is like this, in that they either happen or they simply don't. And once they happen, if they are not instantaneous, like the stagger provided by impact, or if they're not permanent, like Corrosive's armor stripping, then they last for a duration, which can be similar to petrify. Another distinction is how petrify is affected by power strength. Now you'll see some powers that do similar things, like Nova or Creeping Terrify slowing enemies, but that isn't really a cold proc. And I know you probably think that's splitting hairs, but it is what it is. Now another distinction, which is applied to the layers and the distance of petrification, is the fact that the AoE provides different levels of crowd control. No other status is hurt by range in this way. Now the worst distinction between other status types and petrification is you cannot inflict a status on a petrified enemy, which means that enemies under petrification are not made easy targets, which is definitely to the detriment of petrification, unless you conveniently manage to land them on a target before they are petrified. But wait, you can't because you're locked into an animation. So you may be arriving at the conclusion that I'm not a fan of this power, but I assure you you're mistaken. I am simply being thorough and pointing out the weaknesses of this power as I would with any other. And with Petrify, there are definitely many. It's a slow-moving effect that occurs over time. It requires that you put away your weapons. It slows your movement, disables dodging. Its effects diminish with range. No other powers are usable while it's active. It makes enemies tougher by immunizing them to status. It kind of makes you the best player on the enemy's team in some ways, but then maybe there are other ways to use it that aren't so straightforward. So now that we've gotten all of the bad out of the way, let's move to the benefits. For starters, even though you may not petrify enemies with maximum range, you will still stagger or panic them, and possibly slow them. Moreover, the way that Atlas's power kit mods, you're not likely to be in a scenario where you don't have the power strength in the positive unless you're playing for the novelty of having dwarf golems. I mean, power strength enhances all of his abilities in a way that few other stats aid, so much that it's as vital to Atlas as duration would be to Nyx or Loki. But overextended is fairly unnecessary with him. Only one other power that he has truly reacts to range, but even with that power, overextended is not a necessity in any scenario that Atlas is really built for. Now, range is still important to powers like Landslide, so if you are one of those that wants your Landslide combo to last longer or something, you may consider counteracting narrow-minded with Stretch. If you aren't one of those, you'll do just fine without. Now, on the other hand, if you wanted to run a build that's primarily focused on Petrify, Stretch is very much a good idea. But on that cue, the Ramish build. You may recognize this build and loadout from previous videos, as this is my most commonly used build with Atlas, and I rarely deviate from it unless I have something in particular in mind, like a squad composition. For this build, I tend to use Petrify sparingly because this is a build that primarily focuses on Landslide, but the power strength is still enough for an all-around versatile build. Now, I tend to rely on Petrify with this build for heavy units, eliminating the threat, and then I use them kind of as a bag of rats, so to speak. Now, I can see you guys scratching your head why I would put an all-purpose build on a power-specific video, but keep in mind that Petrify is only a portion of his kit. And before we get to the min-maxing stuff coming later, it's good to understand that every power is a part of a kit. Gone are the days of a Desecrate-only Necros, and I hope against hope that one day we will see all of these EV Trinity-only people realize that she has more than one power. Now, integrating every power in a kit into your strategy will always develop better skill, versatility, and will in time eliminate that ridiculous belief that versatility is somehow a bad thing. And yes, I'm looking at you, Oberon haters. So, second build. Gorgomancer. This is a loadout that is geared towards crowd control and summoning, and when it comes to specters and rumblers, oftentimes, their only purpose is that of distraction. But in this scenario, you call upon the reserves of specters to be your primary damage dealers as you petrify enemies over a fairly wide range and let your horde do the talking for you. This is a fairly expensive build in terms of the specters that you'll use and the restores that you'll likely be using as well, but it's the best scaling he has, to be honest. Eventually, the massive damage that Landslide does will also fall off, and at that point you just kind of decide that the enemies are just not going to do anything to you. Between the specters, which always scale with enemy level, and the fact that Petrify doesn't discriminate when it comes to enemy levels, you should have no problem halting enemies in their tracks. Now, in the event that you run out of energy or simply do not have the mass reserve of specters that might sustain it further, I tend to carry a sniper rifle with this build, as headshots are incredibly easy to manage on targets that don't move. Who'd have guessed it? Am I right? The final build. Terra Sect. This build is a hybrid of the two, hence the name Terra, referring to earth-based powers, and Sect as an intersect. For this build, we are doing a little bit of everything. I know, it has 2 augments, and that seems a bit odd for some people. But this is probably the best crowd control build you will ever see an Atlas do, and it contributes greatly to loot as well, and it lets you smash people's face in with reckless abandon. Not as much as Gorgomancer does in terms of producing additional loot, and not as much as Raimish will in terms of pounding faces in, but it still is a fairly good build. Now, maybe I'm just patting myself on the back with this next part, but I believe that I've discovered something that I haven't seen anybody talk about. While Petrify and its augment will scan enemies into the codex, this effect is isolated to the power, but I noticed in testing that the amount of loot produced by Terra Sect was regularly greater than the amount using my Raimish build, despite, during playtesting, never once using the power petrified during these tests. We did, however, destroy enemies petrified by Path of Statues. We destroyed enemies petrified by Unairu's various effects that petrify, from Basilisk Flare or Medusa Skin. And at the end of the day, we made sure that we didn't kill anything that wasn't petrified, with very few exceptions, mainly being the first Path of Statues we set up around the pod, or something to that effect. And at the end of the mission, I was reliably gaining more loot with the Terra Sect than I was with Raimish, but not as much as I would with Gorgomancer, which pretty much doubles the amount of loot, if not more. Now, this kind of makes sense, because with as many enemies that had to die without yet being petrified, I'm not sure if this is a bug, or maybe RNG was just standing on its head consistently, but it appears that petrified means petrified when you're reading the Orgaze augment, regardless of the source. Kind of like a shared effect, like one dude uses stasis and the other guy uses cataclysm, and it works together. You know what I'm saying? And that's it for today, folks. I truly hope that I helped you with this, and I'm eager to see if you can verify with me that petrify does, in fact, mean petrify regardless of the source, or if I just happen to be consistently lucky. With that being said, if you like what I do here, hit that like button. If you want to see more, go ahead and subscribe for more Warframe content. And if you just can't wait to hear my voice again, go ahead and hit that notification button. Until next time, this is Finn, signing off.